Vladimir Kara-Murza, the journalist and historian turned political activist who, until just a few months ago, was a prisoner of Russian President Vladimir Putin's regime. He was imprisoned in 2022 on charges of treason and spreading false information after speaking out against Putin's war in Ukraine, and was later sentenced to 25 years in prison. At one point, Kara-Murza was transferred to a remote Siberian penal colony where he was held in an isolation cell. But he continued writing in prison, including regular columns for the Washington Post, for which he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in commentary. And he continued to speak out against the Russian dictator. His wife, Evgenia, also took up his fight during his imprisonment and never stopped fighting for his release. But while Vladimir Kara-Murza expected to die in Vladimir Putin's gulag, just as his friend and fellow dissident Alexei Navalny did in February of last year. Last August, Kara-Murza found himself suddenly released as part of the largest prisoner swap since the Cold War. After 2 years in prison, Vladimir and Evgenia Kara-Murza and their family were welcomed to the White House by President Biden. And Vladimir Kara-Murza has been working steadily since his release, lobbying the West to take stronger action against Putin. And Vladimir and Evgenia Kara-Murza join me now. And I just said this to you privately in the green room. I will say it to you again. It is such a relief to see you, because the last time I saw you actually sitting exactly in the positions we are now, I asked you why you would even think to go back to Russia. And then after that, our friend Ali Velshi was the last interview that you did before going home, and he asked you the same thing.
I was actually in Moscow. We did an interview by video link.
Indeed.
I was at my home in Moscow, and he was in Lviv, Ukraine, and that was the last interview the day before I was arrested.
It was the day before I was arrested, but that's exactly right. Number one, why on earth did you go? And how surprised were you when you were released?
Well, look, I'm a Russian politician. A politician has to be in his or her own country. Cannot be any other way. I mean, we did find out during COVID that a lot of professions can be done remotely or by Zoom, but politics is not one of them.
Yeah.
And to me, this is a question of basic ethics, because what moral right would I have to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up to Putin's dictatorship if I wasn't prepared to do it myself? I think those people who aspire to be public figures, who aspire to be political leaders, have a responsibility that frankly transcends the considerations of personal safety and personal comfort. And this is especially true in a time of crisis, a time of repression, in a time of war. It is the responsibility of political leaders to be with their people in their own country. And so the thought that never crossed my mind that I would not be in Russia, especially at a time like this.
And were you surprised by your release? What did you know about your release prior to it happening?
I knew absolutely nothing. This was a really bizarre story, really unexpected, completely surreal. This began in late July for me. I was sitting in my solitary confinement cell in the maximum security prison in Omsk in Western Siberia, when suddenly the prison officers came into my cell and escorted me to some sort of a prison office. There was a small room with a desk, a chair, a big portrait of Vladimir Putin on the wall. And on a desk there was a pre-printed template of some kind, a blank sheet of paper and a pen. The officers told me to sit down and write this with my own hand. So I looked at it, and it was a petition for pardon addressed to Vladimir Putin. And initially I thought this was a prank, so I just started laughing and looked at them, but their facial expression did not indicate that they were in the mood for joking. So I said, "What is this?" And he said, "Well, please write this and sign this." I said, I'm never writing something like this." I said, "Why not?" I said, "Well, because I do not consider Vladimir Putin to be a legitimate president of my country. I consider him to be a usurper, a dictator, and a murderer. And I'm not going to ask him of anything. And secondly, I'm certainly not going to admit my guilt, because that's what they wanted as well, because I'm not the one who is the criminal here. The real criminals are those people who are sitting in the Kremlin, who have started this war of aggression against Ukraine, not those of us who are in prison because we had opposed it." So that was a really bizarre episode. And then a couple of days later, I was woken up in the middle of the night, told to get up and get my things ready in 10 minutes. And at that moment, I was absolutely certain that I was going to be let out and be executed. But instead of the nearby forest, they took me to an airport and flew me to Moscow. Handcuffs with a police escort, but on a regular passenger plane. And in Moscow, I was transferred to Leforto, which is a place well known from Russian literature. This is the notorious NKVD KGB prison that once held legendary opponents of the Kremlin like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Vladimir Bukovsky and Natan Sharansky. Nobody explained anything. I was just held there again in solitary confinement for several days, and then on the morning of the 1st of August, which was the day of the exchange, they told me to collect my belongings and go down. And there was a row of men standing there, and their faces covered with black balaclavas, and even after everything I've seen in prison, that was still a pretty intimidating sight. And they told me to get into a bus. There was some kind of a bus parked inside the prison courtyard. And I did, and inside the bus there were more men in black masks. These were members of the FSB Special Elite Squad, so-called Alpha Group. But next to each of them, next to each of these FSB guys, I saw a friend, a colleague, a fellow political prisoners who were, doing time in prisons all over Russia. And it was only at that moment that I understood what was happening, because there could only be one reason why we would all be on the same bus together. And a very quick ride to the airport. We were put on a government plane, on a Russian government plane, and flown to Turkey. And then, and that's where the exchange took place, on the tarmac of Ankara Airport on the 1st of August, 2024.
It is absolutely extraordinary, and Evgeny, when I had the chance to interview Brittany Griner, who was an American, obviously incarcerated in Putin's gulags as well, and one of the points that she made, including in her book, is that the ordeal becomes an ordeal for the family as well. There's a certain incarceration for the family as well, for the wife, for the children, because you have no idea whether you'll ever see your loved one again. Talk to me about how you handled this situation. And how aware and how afraid were you given what happened to Alexei Navalny?
Vladimir and I have been married for over 20 years now, and he hasn't changed a bit. So actually, I knew who he was all those 20 years ago. I knew who I was marrying, and I knew that I knew of his ambitions, I knew of his beliefs, I knew of his principles, and I knew that he would always be prepared to stand up for them, to stand up to Putin, to challenge autocracy in our country, and that he would be prepared to go any lengths, to risk his life again and again. And this is actually what has been happening to our family for years now. The first time Vladimir ended up in a coma after the first poisoning was in 2015. Just 3 months after the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, who was our middle child's godfather. Then in 2017, Vladimir was poisoned for the second time. And again, there was a coma, a multiple organ failure. And yet again, he had to relearn how to walk and talk and hold a spoon. So we've been living this for years, for almost 10 years now. And I think that I've sort of come to terms with that, because I understand that Vladimir's cause is much bigger than just our family, than just our life. And and I know that he teaches our kids through his own experience what it is to stand up for what you believe in, to fight for what you believe in. And it is a harrowing experience. It is a horrific experience to see that despair and fear, and also fury in your kids' eyes. No mother ever wants to see that. As parents, we want to protect our kids. As parents, we want to make the world safer for them. But in a way, this is exactly what Vladimir is doing. And I think that we cannot protect our kids from everything. And I know for sure that we're not going to be able to leave them the perfect world. It's never going to happen. But what we can do for them now as parents is that we can teach them to fight. We can teach them to become warriors and to fight for what they believe in. And in this regard, Vladimir is the best teacher ever. And I don't think that I really had any choice in the matter either. I do believe that what Vladimir has been doing for all of these years is right. I do believe that this is the right thing to do, and this is definitely worth fighting for. So when he was imprisoned, I thought that the best way I could help him was by continuing his work. So I just stood up, and I have been working with my amazing colleagues from the Free Russia Foundation, a civil society organization that helps, promotes, encourages, and supports all sorts of anti-war and pro-democracy activities and initiatives. And I have been very lucky to have such amazing colleagues and friends. And now, of course, I'm extremely, extremely blessed to have Vladimir back. And their families, well, you mentioned Alexei Navalny, who was murdered in prison in February of last year. There was also talented musician Pavel Kushner, who died on a hunger strike just 3 days before this historic exchange took place. There are thousands of people held in Putin's prisons, not just Russian political prisoners, but also Ukrainian civil hostages and war prisoners and kids. All of these thousands and thousands of people in Putin's prisons and Lukashenko's prisons, they need our support.
Indeed.
And they need to be saved. And this is why this work will never be done until there are still political prisoners in our countries and until Vladimir Putin is allowed to conduct his absolutely atrocious criminal aggressions against our neighbors.
My exit question to you then, Vladimir kara-murza, I mean, and you know, we laud your bravery and you are determined to continue to fight for a free Russia. But I think for a lot of Americans, what we've seen is Vladimir Putin entrenched. He now will have a very friendly regime in the United States that supports his territorial ambitions in Ukraine. I read a recent interview in which you said that you're an optimist about Russia, you're an optimist about the U.S. How can you be optimistic when so many Americans fear that essentially Vladimir Putin has won?
Well, first of all, on your point that Vladimir Putin seems entrenched, he does indeed seem entrenched, but seem is the key word here. The Soviet regime seemed entrenched and it seemed to be there forever. And then it collapsed in 3 days in August 1991, and nobody saw it coming. This is how things usually happen in Russia. So you ask what makes me an optimist? Because I'm a historian. And actually, I have to say that my education as a historian probably never came as useful to me as it did when I was in prison, because it sort of puts your perspective into place. Whichever way we look at it, if we look at the last, I don't know, let's say last half a century, the progress for democracy in the world has been incredible. Just a few decades ago, democracy seemed as distant in countries like Brazil or South Africa or South Korea or Spain as it seems today in Russia or Belarus and Venezuela. But look at all these countries today, they're all successful democracies. If we look at the map of Europe, just 4 decades ago, which is nothing by historical standards, that's like yesterday morning, we would see that half of European countries back then were living under various forms of totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. If we look at the map of Europe today, we'll find only 2 dictatorships left. That's Putin's Russia and Lukashenko's Belarus. And so the direction is unmistakable. The arc of history may not bend as fast as we'd like, or as straight as we'd like, but the direction is towards liberty, there's absolutely no question. So, yes, I absolutely am an optimist, but it's not, unfounded, pink glasses sort of optimism. It's educated optimism of a historian who knows that the laws of history cannot be altered, they cannot be changed, they certainly cannot be stopped. Nobody's ever been able to stop the course of history, and Vladimir Putin is not going to be an exception. Russia will be a democratic country, a normal, modern, European democratic country, and I'm certain that this is going to happen much quicker than people may expect.
You make us all optimistic, Vladimir and Evgenia kara-murza. So brave, so valiant, and we are so relieved to see you. Thank you both so much.
It's wonderful to be back in your studio. Thank you so much.
Look, if you guys can fight, I think we can do it too. Cheers. Thank you very much. We'll be right back.